I thought we were celebrating. Daniel had made the reservation weeks in advance. A corner table at the Meridian, white linen, a sommelier who floated between tables as though the floor itself were made of cloud. I believed, with the full and foolish warmth of a mother who wants nothing more than to be wanted, that my son had chosen this evening because he missed me, because for once his wife had agreed that I deserved a seat at the table. I had no idea that the dinner had been orchestrated down to its final detail, not as a celebration, but as a stage. And I had no idea that Vanessa, my daughter-in-law of 6 years, had already rehearsed the exact moment she would break me. She had chosen the restaurant specifically. She had chosen the table specifically. She had even, I would later learn, chosen my seat, the one facing the room where every other guest could see my face when she was done with me. She called me poor in a voice like a blade sliding between ribs. She brought the back of her hand down on the edge of my plate with a sharp crack that sent it skidding across the white linen, and she told me, loudly enough for the woman in the green dress at the adjacent table to flinch, that people like me did not belong in restaurants like this. She said it while smiling. That was the part that never left me, not the plate, not the words, the smile. That bright, practiced, utterly empty arc of lips that had learned to mimic warmth without ever once producing it. It was the smile of a woman who had been planning this for months. It was the smile of a woman who believed with absolute certainty that she had already won. She was wrong in ways she could not yet imagine, and I was about to show her exactly how wrong. But I should start at the beginning, because this story, like all the ones that matter, begins not with a crash, but with quiet, with coffee and morning light and the particular kind of happiness that is only visible in retrospect once it has been taken from you. My name is Margaret Holloway. I am 68 years old, and for most of my adult life I have been the kind of woman that people overlook in a crowd. Not unpleasantly. I simply don't announce myself. I have always preferred wool cardigans to cashmere blazers. I keep my silver hair short and clean. I wear flat shoes because I like to walk without thinking about my feet, and I drive a 10-year-old Volvo that I take to the same mechanic my husband used to use, a kind man named Pete, who still calls me Mrs. H and always checks my tire pressure without my asking. People who don't know me tend to place me immediately into a category. The category has a pleasant, slightly condescending name. It usually involves words like sweet and retired, and on particularly pointed occasions, simple. I have never once corrected this impression. Silence, I learned long ago, is the most underestimated form of power in any room. My husband Robert built Holloway Capital over 35 years of 6-day work weeks and an instinct for property that I have never fully been able to explain. He had a sense for it, the way some people can smell rain before a cloud appears. He saw value in places others had written off, and he was patient in a way that the market consistently rewards, even when it pretends not to. When Robert died, 4 years ago, quietly, in the blue chair in our study with a glass of scotch and a book of Chekhov's stories, he left me everything. The portfolio, the holdings, the silent partnership agreements, the investment accounts, the building on Callaway Street, the 17% stake in Meridian Hospitality Group, which operates 8 restaurants across the city, including the Meridian itself, the restaurant where my daughter-in-law was, at that very moment, practicing her cruelty. But I am getting ahead of myself again. Robert and I had one child together, a son. Daniel Robert Holloway, born in a difficult March on a night so cold the window panes cracked from the inside, and I thought, looking at that red, furious face, that here was a person who had arrived in the world ready to fight something. I was wrong about what he would choose to fight, but that is a grief for later. Daniel grew into a handsome, clever, somewhat anxious man with a talent for architecture and an unfortunate tendency to solve conflict by pretending it didn't exist. He was easy to love and occasionally infuriating to trust, and for most of his adult life, the things I needed to forgive him for were small and manageable. His relationship with Vanessa Caldwell changed that arithmetic entirely. He met her at a firm dinner. She was 31, newly promoted to marketing director at Aldine and Associates, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car and a confidence that I initially mistook for competence. She was beautiful in the specific, aggressive way of someone who has spent a great deal of money and effort constructing that beauty, and I don't mean that unkindly. I mean that there was something architectural about her, as though every element had been chosen for maximum effect. Daniel was smitten from their third sentence. I watched it happen at the dinner table when he first brought her home. That particular softening of a man's face when he has decided, without consultation, to reorganize his life around another person. I smiled. I poured more wine. I said all the right things, and I meant most of them. The first year was genuinely pleasant. Vanessa was charming in controlled doses. She called me Margaret, not Mom, which I respected because it was at least honest. She sent thank you notes after dinners, remembered that I preferred white roses to red, and asked me questions about Robert that seemed at the time like genuine curiosity. I kept my house on Elmwood, the one Robert and I had lived in for 31 years, white clapboard, a deep porch, 2 silver maples that canopy the front yard in summer until it looks like the inside of a green cathedral. Daniel and Vanessa bought a new construction on the east side, glass and steel and vertical lines that Vanessa described as the aesthetic of arrival, which I thought was a beautiful way to describe a building that would not age well. I visited every 2 weeks for Sunday lunch. It was pleasant. I was careful not to crowd, and Vanessa was careful not to reveal. And for a long time, we maintained the comfortable fiction that we were getting on beautifully. The fiction began to develop visible cracks in the second year, but cracks, I have found, are easy to ignore when you are willing to look slightly to the left of them. The first sign was subtle. Vanessa began asking questions about my finances with an enthusiasm that I initially attributed to professional habit. She was, after all, in marketing. She dealt in numbers, metrics, projections. But the questions had a specific direction to them. How was I managing the portfolio on my own? Did I have someone I trusted to look after things? Wasn't it a great deal of pressure for a woman of my age to be managing so many moving parts? She always framed these inquiries with a certain buttery concern. Her head tilted just slightly, her voice pitched to register care and not calculation. I am a woman who has spent 68 years reading rooms, and I read this one accurately from the first sentence. I simply didn't yet know how far the map extended. By the third year, the questions had evolved. Vanessa began making gentle observations about the Elmwood house, how large it was for one person, how much upkeep a property of that age must require, how the neighborhood had changed, how it might be, perhaps, more practical for me to consider downsizing into something more manageable. The word practical appeared in her vocabulary with a frequency that I began to track privately, the way you track the recurring motif in a piece of music you haven't yet fully understood. She also began mentioning, with increasing frequency, a real estate development on the North Shore. New construction, retirement-friendly, very reasonable, that her colleague's firm was developing. I nodded. I smiled. I said I would think about it. I did not think about it. Daniel, for his part, was largely a bystander during this period. Or so he appeared. He would redirect the conversation when Vanessa pressed too hard about the property, offering me a second cup of tea or asking about my garden, and I interpreted this as the action of a man trying to keep peace between two women he loved. I was wrong. I know that now. But at the time, I still believed that his instinct was protection rather than calculation, and this belief, soft, stubborn, entirely maternal, kept me from seeing the full picture for longer than it should have. The fourth sign, the one I should have taken more seriously, came 6 months before the dinner at the Meridian. I was visiting on a Sunday in October, the kind of afternoon where the light is amber and slanted and makes everything look kinder than it is, and I arrived slightly earlier than expected because my parking had been easier than usual. I let myself in with the spare key Daniel had given me. He'd said explicitly, "Use it whenever, Mom. This is your house too." And I heard their voices before I reached the kitchen. The words themselves were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Sharp, clipped, intense. Not arguing, they were not arguing. They were agreeing, which is sometimes worse. By the time I appeared in the doorway with my coat still on and a bottle of wine in one hand, they had both rearranged their expressions into something open and welcome, and Daniel was already asking whether I'd had trouble parking. I smiled. I put the wine down on the counter. I noted, with the quiet, methodical part of my mind that never entirely turns off, that the laptop on the kitchen table had been closed in a hurry, and that Vanessa's hands were folded on top of it with the specific deliberateness of someone covering something she doesn't want seen. I said nothing. I poured myself a glass of water and listened to the sound of the afternoon pretending everything was fine. Thomas Eckhart, my financial advisor and the man who had been Robert's closest partner for 22 years, called me the following Monday. He did this every few months, not for any formal reason, but because Thomas was the kind of person who believed that important relationships required maintenance, the way old houses do. He had a voice like dark wood, unhurried and warm, and he always began the same way. "Margaret, how are we?" That Monday, after the usual pleasantries, he mentioned, almost in passing, that Daniel had contacted the firm several weeks prior. He had asked, in his own name, for information about the process of establishing a power of attorney over a parent's financial affairs. Thomas said it, the way you say something you know will hurt, with great care, and with the knowledge that no amount of care makes it hurt less. I thanked him. I put the phone down. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time and listened to the silver maple outside the window, which was losing its leaves in the October wind, one at a time, with a quiet and unstoppable patience. The call from Daniel came 4 days later, not to discuss what Thomas had mentioned, but to invite me to dinner. "The Meridian," he said, "next Friday. Just the three of us, a nice evening. He wanted to celebrate the fact that I'd been managing so brilliantly since Dad. His voice was warm and practiced, and I said yes because I am his mother and because I needed to see the shape of what was coming before I could respond to it properly. And so I put on my gray wool dress, the comfortable shoes, the small pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, and I drove my 10-year-old Volvo to the best restaurant in the city with the particular calm of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do and is simply waiting for the right moment to do it. The Meridian occupied the ground floor of the Callaway building on the corner of 5th and Callaway. And this detail is more relevant than it might appear, but I will come back to that. It was beautiful in the specific, intentional way of places that have been designed to make you feel that you have arrived somewhere significant. The ceiling was coffered and lit from within, warm honey gold. The carpet was deep burgundy and absorbed sound like velvet. The tables were spaced generously, white linens pressed to architectural sharpness, and the air carried the mingled scents of roasted garlic, good wine, and something floral that I could not immediately identify. Lily, perhaps, or white peony. A young woman in black met me at the entrance, and Daniel was already waiting near the host stand, hands in his pockets, tie slightly too tight, the particular expression on his face that I have recognized since he was 7 years old and had done something he felt bad about. He hugged me. He smelled of the same cologne he'd worn for 20 years, cedar and citrus, and for a moment I just held on to him. This man who had once been a small boy, who called me into his room because he was afraid of the dark, and I felt the enormous ordinary sorrow of knowing that the evening was not going to go the way he pretended it would. Vanessa was already at the table. She was wearing a cream silk blouse and a jacket the color of cognac that fit her with the precision of something custom made. Her hair was blown perfectly straight. She had chosen the restaurant, the table, and the chair I would sit in, and she looked exactly like someone who had chosen all of those things. She stood when I approached, a courtesy she employed in public and rarely in private, and kissed the air near my cheek with the practiced warmth of a woman performing pleasant daughter-in-law for the room. She smelled of something expensive, neroli or jasmine, the kind of perfume that announces itself 3 feet before the person wearing it. I sat down, I unfolded my napkin. I looked at the menu with genuine interest because even on difficult evenings, good food is good food, and I see no reason not to appreciate it. The first 40 minutes were almost pleasant in the way that a very good forgery can be almost beautiful. Vanessa was solicitous, passing bread, filling my water glass, asking about my garden with what appeared to be interest. Daniel was slightly too loud, slightly too cheerful, the specific register of a person performing relaxation rather than experiencing it. I asked after their colleagues, their recent trip to Lisbon, the new kitchen renovation they'd mentioned in August. I was very good at this kind of conversation. I had been having it for 6 years. The restaurant hummed around us, cutlery on china, the low tide of other people's conversations, a cello quartet stationed near the bar playing something I recognized as Debussy. I ate my first course, a beautiful cold bisque with a thin curl of cream and a scattering of chive, and I thought, let them come to it in their own time. They came to it with the entree. The plates arrived. Duck confit for Daniel, seared scallops for Vanessa, and for me a simple roasted chicken with roasted root vegetables, which I had ordered because I genuinely wanted it and because I have long since stopped making food choices based on what they communicate to other people at the table. It was Vanessa who opened it. She did so by clearing her throat with a delicacy that was entirely performative, setting down her fork with the careful deliberateness of a person who has rehearsed this moment, and saying, in the pleasant, organized tone she reserved for professional presentations, that she and Daniel had been thinking about my situation and they wanted to talk to me about some practical steps toward protecting my future. I said I was listening. She explained, in the smooth and structured way of someone who has prepared a document, that they were concerned about my ability to continue managing the portfolio independently. She mentioned my age. She mentioned the complexity of the assets. She mentioned, with particular delicacy, I thought, that Robert's arrangements had been made with the assumption that he would be present to manage them, and that my continuing to do so alone, at my age, was a risk to everyone's stability. The word everyone sat in the air between us for a moment. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his duck. He had been looking at his duck for quite some time. I said that the portfolio had performed 12% above market average in the last fiscal year. Vanessa smiled, that same blade-edge arc, and said that, of course, I had done a wonderful job, but there were professional mechanisms designed for situations like mine, and that, naturally, they had already spoken with a lawyer about the most sensible way to structure things going forward, so that I would be protected and they could all rest easier. She slid a single folded document across the table toward my bread plate. I looked at it without touching it, the way you look at something you already know the shape of. A power of attorney agreement. My name at the top. Daniel's name below mine. And Vanessa's name. Neatly typed in the same font as everything else, as though it were entirely natural, below Daniel's. I looked at the document. I looked at my son. He was still looking at his duck, and something in me, something I had been keeping at the exact right temperature for weeks, contained and controlled and waiting, shifted a single degree in a direction that was not quite warmth and not quite cold, but something more precise than either. I picked up my wine glass. I took a slow sip of a very good Burgundy. I set it back down, and I said, in a voice that I kept entirely even, that I appreciated their concern and that I would need some time to consider it, and that I thought it best if we changed the subject for now and enjoyed the rest of our meal. Vanessa's face changed, not dramatically. It was a subtle recalibration, a tightening around the eyes, a shift in the set of her jaw. She had expected either agreement or tearful protest. She had not expected equilibrium. She picked up her fork. She cut a scallop in half. She put it down again. Then she looked at me, and her voice lost the professional veneer and became something smaller and sharper, and she said, "Margaret, I think you need to understand something." She said it the way you say something to a person you have decided to stop pretending to respect. She said that they had been waiting a very long time for me to be reasonable about the property situation, and that I needed to consider what was best for the family, and that Daniel supported this completely. At which point she looked at Daniel with a look that was not encouragement so much as instruction, and Daniel set down his fork and said in a voice barely above a murmur, "Mum, she's right. We just want what's best." I looked at my son for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone at the table. Then I looked back at Vanessa, and she mistook my silence for defeat, because that is the particular blindness of people who have never been beaten by someone who was smiling. She said, "You're not being realistic about your situation. This house, this portfolio, it's too much for one person. Robert built it for a family, not for you to sit in alone and pretend nothing has changed." Her voice had taken on a slight elevation of volume now, a tremor of something that was either genuine emotion or a very skillful imitation of it. She said that I was clinging to things I couldn't manage. She said, and this is where her voice crossed a line that she had perhaps not consciously intended to cross, but had certainly been moving toward for 6 years. She said that maybe I didn't understand where I actually stood in the scheme of things. She picked up her wine glass and looked at me over the rim and said, "Let's be honest with each other, shall we? You dress like you shop at charity sales. You drive a car that embarrasses Daniel in front of his colleagues. You come to restaurants like this and order chicken. You don't belong here, Margaret, and it would save all of us a great deal of grief if you would just accept that." I heard the adjacent tables go quiet in the specific attentive way that rooms go quiet when they sense that something real is happening. Then she brought the back of her hand down on the edge of my plate. Not with full force. She was not, I think, entirely in control of herself by this point, but hard enough that the plate slid a full inch across the white linen and the bisque spoon rattled, and the couple at the next table looked up in a way they immediately tried to disguise. She said clearly and loudly enough for them to hear, "Poor people don't belong here, and once you sign that document, you can go back to wherever it is you actually fit in." The room was very still. The cello had paused, or perhaps I simply could not hear it anymore over the particular quality of silence that follows a public humiliation. The kind that presses in from all sides, thick and muffling, full of the sound of other people witnessing something they will remember. I looked at Vanessa for a long moment. She was breathing slightly too fast. There was a small flush at her throat, visible above the cream silk collar. She had said the thing out loud, finally, the thing she had been building toward for 6 years, and she looked, not triumphant, not entirely, but not ashamed either. She looked like someone who had committed to a move in chess and was waiting to see whether it had worked. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his hands on the table. His face had the specific slack quality of a person who knows what they have allowed to happen and cannot yet face what that knowledge means about them. I picked up my napkin. I folded it with the same care I had been folding napkins my entire adult life, precisely, quietly, setting it beside my plate. I stood up from the table. I reached for my bag, the small brown leather bag that I have owned for 11 years and that Vanessa had once described to a mutual acquaintance as the kind of thing you give to a charity shop when you move house. I put its strap over my shoulder. I smiled at Vanessa, not the smile I give friends, but the particular, level, entirely unreadable smile I give people when I have already decided what I am going to do next and they do not yet know that a decision has been made. Then I walked at an unhurried pace through the restaurant, past the couple at the adjacent table who were very pointedly examining their menus, past the sommelier who gave me a small, uncertain nod, past the host stand and through the heavy glass door and out onto the pavement on the corner of 5th and Callaway. The evening air was cool. October again, or perhaps November? No, October. The leaves still on the silver maples lining the block, amber under the streetlights. I stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed, the way you breathe after holding your breath for something long enough that you have forgotten you were holding it. The city went on around me, unhurried, indifferent, its taxis and its bicycles and its people in their coats, all of them entirely unaware that 6 years of patience had just arrived at its destination. I opened my bag. I took out my phone. I scrolled to a name I had not used in a professional capacity since the previous spring, and I pressed call. It rang twice. Thomas Eckhart answered on the third ring, which was unusual for a Friday evening, but Thomas had always treated unusual hours as simply part of the geography of trust. "Margaret," he said, "how are we?" I told him where I was. I told him what had just happened. I told him in the specific and factual way I prefer when delivering information of consequence that I was standing outside the Meridian restaurant, of which we jointly held 17%, and that I had just been told by my daughter-in-law in the dining room that poor people did not belong there, and that I thought it was an appropriate moment to have a brief conversation with the general manager. I paused. I waited. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. A sound of recognition, perhaps, the specific frequency of someone who has waited a long time for a particular chapter to conclude. He said, "Give me 4 minutes." I put my phone in my bag. I stood on the pavement. I watched a taxi pull to the curb and release a young couple in formal clothes, laughing at something, leaning into each other with the unself-conscious ease of people who have not yet had to learn anything hard. I thought about Robert. I thought about the afternoon he had first taken me to see the Callaway building, when it was still half empty and smelled of old carpet and ambition, and he had stood in the lobby and said, "Maggie, this is going to matter someday." He was right about most things eventually. I went back inside. I did not return to the table. I stood near the host stand and I waited, and I watched through the latticed partition as Vanessa leaned across the table toward Daniel in the particular way of someone consolidating a victory, gesturing toward the folded document still sitting beside my bread plate. Daniel had picked up his wine again. His shoulders had the slightly rounded set of a man who has agreed to something he will spend years trying to justify to himself. I stood there and I felt with a clarity that was almost physical the exact shape of what had been built against me. The years of questions, the power of attorney, the plan for the house, the restaurant chosen deliberately so that the setting would intimidate and the public humiliation would paralyze. It had been a good plan. It had taken considerable thought. I would have found it more impressive if it had been aimed at anyone other than a woman who had spent 30 years learning, at Robert's side, the architecture of exactly this kind of strategy. James Whitfield, the general manager of the Meridian, appeared from the direction of the kitchen at 3 minutes and 40 seconds after I had ended my call with Thomas. He was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s, dark suit, silver tie, the composed expression of someone who has managed difficult situations in expensive rooms for long enough that composure has become his natural climate. He saw me. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise, precisely, but the specific adjustment of a person who has just been given accurate context. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. Thomas called ahead. "I'm so sorry for the circumstances." He shook my hand with both of his. Then he looked toward the dining room, toward the corner table, toward the woman in the cognac jacket who was, at that moment, saying something that was making Daniel nod. "I'll handle it," James said. I thanked him. I found a chair near the host stand and I sat down, and I waited, and I watched. James crossed the dining room with the unhurried authority of a man who owns every step between himself and his destination. He reached the corner table and he stopped beside it, and he said something. I was too far away to hear the words precisely, but I heard the register, low and measured, the particular tone of a person delivering information that changes the temperature of a room. I saw Vanessa look up. I saw her begin to speak, to smile, to deploy the practiced warmth, to start the performance of course, there's been a misunderstanding. I saw James produce, from the inside pocket of his jacket, a folded card. A business card, I would later learn, though I couldn't see the name on it from where I sat, and place it on the table beside her untouched scallops. I saw him speak again, a few sentences, patient, unhurried. The way you speak when you are holding every card in the deck and there is no advantage in rushing. I saw Daniel's face change first, a slow draining of color, starting at the jaw, moving upward, and then I saw Vanessa's face. I saw the smile stop. I watched it go out like a match in a closed room. What James said to her, as he told me afterward, he had been asked by the Management and Investment Committee of Meridian Hospitality Group to advise the guests at table 14 that the primary silent partner of the group had been dining this evening and had been subject to conduct inconsistent with the establishment's standards of courtesy. He had also advised them that Aldine and Associates, the firm where Vanessa held her position as marketing director, had been a finalist for a hospitality consulting contract with one of the portfolio companies under the Holloway Capital umbrella, a contract valued at approximately $1.7 million, and that in light of this evening's events, the committee had determined that their preferred candidate would be selected from among the remaining firms on the shortlist. He told me that Vanessa had not moved for approximately 6 seconds after he finished speaking. He told me that Daniel had put his head in his hands. He told me that Vanessa had then asked, very quietly, whether the primary silent partner might be persuaded to reconsider, and that he had told her with the regret of a man who does not actually regret anything. I'm afraid that is entirely at her discretion. I was already in my coat when James returned to me. He offered me a car, but I preferred the Volvo. He offered me a table for a quiet dessert, but I had eaten enough for one evening. He walked me to the door himself, and before I went through it, he said, very simply, in the understated way of someone who has watched a great deal of theater and knows how to appreciate good staging, "Your husband would have enjoyed this, I think." I smiled at him. I said Robert would have said it was entirely unnecessary, and then asked for every detail twice. James laughed in a way that sounded like it came from somewhere real, and I walked out into the October evening and got into my old Volvo and drove home. The calls started before I reached the end of Calloway Street. Daniel first. I let it ring. Then again. Then a text, "Mum, please pick up." Then Vanessa, which surprised me slightly, the speed of it, though it shouldn't have. She was nothing if not tactical. I turned onto the highway and let the city fall away behind me and drove the 17 minutes to Elmwood in a silence that was so deep and so necessary that I sat in my driveway for a few minutes after I arrived, engine off, hands in my lap, listening to the silver maple in the front yard moving in the October wind. Then I went inside, made a pot of tea, and called my friend Carol, who had been waiting by her phone since I'd texted her from the restaurant pavement because Carol has known me for 40 years and understands that some women need a witness. I told her everything in order, and Carol listened without interruption, which is one of her great and specific gifts. When I finished, she said, "Did you feel bad about it?" And I thought about it honestly, the way you think about things late at night with a cup of tea and the company of someone who doesn't need you to perform anything. I said, not the part about James, not the contract. That was consequence, not cruelty, and there is a difference. The part about Daniel, that I felt, that I had been feeling for months in the way you feel a bone that isn't broken yet but has the particular tenderness of something under stress. I said, I'm going to give him a chance. 1. Carol said, only 1. I said, only 1. He came to Elmwood the following morning, alone, at 8 o'clock, unshaven, with the look of a man who has not slept and knows exactly why. I made him sit at the kitchen table. I poured him coffee. I put a plate of toast between us, and I sat down across from him, and I did not say anything, because in my experience, the most useful thing a mother can do in a moment like this is simply be present and let the silence do its work. Daniel looked at the toast. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the kitchen window, which faces the back garden, the vegetable beds Robert built, the apple tree I have tended since Daniel was 9. Then he looked at me, and he said, I knew about it. Not all of it. Not the restaurant. That was Vanessa. I didn't know she was going to do that. But the document, the plan for the house. I knew, Mum, and I didn't tell you." His voice broke on the last sentence in the specific way of a man in his 40s discovering that he has been less than the person his mother believed him to be. He said, "I thought if the finances were consolidated, it would be simpler. Vanessa said it would protect you. I wanted to believe that was what it was." He paused. He said, "I think I wanted it to be what it was, because the alternative meant I'd let her turn me into someone I don't want to be." I looked at my son for a long time. Then I said, "Yes." He nodded. I said, "I'm going to tell you what I need from you now." He nodded again. I said, "I need you to understand, without ambiguity, that the house and the portfolio are mine, and they will remain mine, and any future conversation about their management will happen between me and Thomas and any lawyer I choose, and not between you and Vanessa behind a closed laptop in a kitchen I arrived at too early." He said, "I know," I said, "and I need you to decide, not for me, not today, but for yourself, and honestly, what kind of marriage you want to be in, and what kind of man you are choosing to be in it." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "She's not a bad person." I said, "That's for you to determine. She was not kind to me." He said, "No." I said, "No." We sat with our coffee and our toast until the kitchen light changed and the apple tree threw its shadow at a different angle, and then Daniel washed the cups and dried them and put them back on the shelf, the way he had always done since he was old enough to reach it, and he hugged me at the door for a long time without saying anything, and I held on, because whatever else was true, he was still the person I had watched arrive in a difficult March 35 years ago, furious and fragile and entirely mine. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were mine. I called Thomas and spent 2 mornings reviewing the entire portfolio, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. Because there is a particular satisfaction in surveying something you have built and protected and know completely, and in letting that knowledge rest in you without apology. The Holloway Capital accountant confirmed that the power of attorney filing, which Daniel had initiated in his own name, had been suspended following his withdrawal of the request, which came, Thomas told me, in a brief and tightly worded email sent from Daniel's personal address at 11:47 on the Friday night, roughly 2 hours after James had delivered his message at table 14. Aldine and Associates received official notification the following Tuesday that the hospitality consulting contract had been awarded to another firm. I was told by Thomas that Vanessa had been in a series of meetings with her managing director in the days that followed. The precise content of those meetings I do not know, but I know the managing director is thorough. I wished her no additional harm. Consequence is not the same as cruelty, and I have never been interested in cruelty. Daniel and Vanessa did not separate immediately. I did not expect them to, and I did not require it. What Daniel required, what he worked toward in the slow and uneven way of real change, was visibility, the ability to see his own choices clearly and to make them from that clarity rather than from the comfortable anesthesia of avoidance. He told me 6 weeks later that they were in counseling. He told me 3 months later that it was difficult. He told me 5 months later that he thought he understood. Finally, the difference between keeping peace and keeping himself. I listened each time. I said very little. A mother's job at a certain point is simply to remain steady, present, still the light on in the window. Thomas called in January to tell me that a development firm had made a formal offer for the Callaway building, significantly above assessed value. I reviewed the offer, noted the firm's portfolio, decided it was sound, and asked him to counter at 8% above their opening position. He came back with an acceptance within the week. I signed in his office on a Wednesday morning in a burgundy chair that faced the window, with a view of the city Robert had loved from every angle. And I felt, not triumph, which is too hot and too temporary, but something quieter, permanence. The particular satisfaction of a woman who has been underestimated for decades and has allowed it, patiently and entirely on purpose, because she understood that being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it yourself. The Meridian is still my restaurant. I still order the roasted chicken when I go. The Debussy Quartet still plays near the bar on Friday evenings, and James still greets me at the door with a handshake and a small, knowing nod, and I still sit at the corner table. The one with the white linen, the one where Vanessa had arranged the chairs so carefully. And I eat my meal slowly, and I watch the room. And sometimes I think about all the things that were built quietly and broken quietly and rebuilt quietly in the space of 6 years and one dinner. And I think, Robert was right. This place matters. The Elmwood house is still white clapboard. The silver maples are still larger every year. My 10-year-old Volvo still starts on the first turn in any weather, and Pete still checks the tire pressure without being asked. I wear my wool cardigans and my flat shoes and my small pearl earrings, and people in rooms still look at me and place me quickly and confidently into the category with the pleasant, slightly condescending name. I still don't correct them. Silence, as I said, is the most underestimated form of power in any room. I know this because I have been using it for 68 years, and it has never once let me down. Some things, once broken, do not fully mend. Trust is not like a table that can be planned and re-glued and returned to its original smoothness. It is more like old glass, which can be repaired but shows the repair always, faintly, in certain lights. I know this, and I have made my peace with it. I have also learned in these months that there is a version of loss that is not purely loss, that when something breaks, it sometimes breaks to reveal the structure underneath, the actual weight-bearing elements that were there all along, invisible because nothing had yet tested them. Daniel is my son. He made a choice I did not deserve, and he has chosen, slowly and imperfectly, to become someone who would not make that choice again. I am watching him do that work. It is the most important thing I have watched him do. And Vanessa, whatever comes of that marriage, whatever choices she and Daniel make in the long, unscripted days ahead, I think about her sometimes with more equanimity than I expected to feel. She looked at a woman in a gray wool dress eating roasted chicken, and she saw a margin to be captured. She saw a retirement account and a property deed and a photograph on a bookshelf. She did not see me. That was always going to be her most expensive mistake, and she has paid for it in the currency she valued most. I do not celebrate that. I simply note it, the way you note the end of a season, with recognition and with the particular composure of someone who has already turned toward what comes next. On the last Sunday of November, I drove to Elmwood at my usual time, made coffee in my usual way, and walked out onto the deep porch with the cup warm in both hands. The silver maples had gone bare. The front yard was full of amber leaves, deep and russet and still, the light slanting across them in long November gold. The street was quiet. A dog walked past with a small girl attached to its leash, both of them perfectly earnest, both of them going somewhere important. I stood there in my flat shoes and my cardigan, and I thought, this is mine. This light, this cold, this morning, this particular quality of stillness that has taken 68 years to earn. No one is taking this from me. No one ever was. I just needed them to try so that I could be sure.